Is the mic on? Okay. Do I need to turn something on here, or are we good? You can hear me. We're live. All right. Okay. Hey, everybody. How you doing? I'm John Lebkowski. I have a company called Polycott Associates, but I'm also here, maybe primarily here as a blogger, and I blog at a site called Weblogski, kind of play on my name, weblogski.com. I've been blogging for a long time. I used to carve my posts in stone, you know. So I have a lot of experience. I know a lot about the subject, but I don't know a lot about what you need to know. So I've got a presentation here that is kind of high level. And if at some point you think you're not getting a question answered that you had a burning desire to have answered in this session, be sure and raise your hand and bring it up. I mean, we should be having a conversation here. It shouldn't just be me blathering to you like a talking head up at the front of the room. Actually, I kind of like this. There's a lot of people who have decided to just quit blogging and go back to doing whatever else they were doing, barking, chasing cats. The blog was really the sort of gateway drug into social media, kind of the first move into, it really wasn't the first. Desktop publishing was first. With desktop publishing, pretty much anybody could publish a little magazine, excuse me, and you saw a lot of magazines being published by like non-traditional, not big publishing organizations, because you could just run it out. I used to publish one of those myself. It's sort of like a democratization of the technology for publishing. And what changes when you can do that, especially when you get to the web, and pretty much anybody can kind of figure out how to add things to the web, is that everybody could potentially become a publisher. And how many people in here are like actually blogging? Okay, we got a few. And I guess the rest of you are kind of interested in it, thinking about doing it. I saw a note over there that said, what is the best blog platform? Don't let me get away without giving you my answer to that question. So the history that leads up to blogging goes from desktop publishing to the web. When the web came along, a lot of people who were publishing zines just using the easy means of production that had like page layout programs and easy ways to print things out, and then you could take them to a publisher if you had bigger ambitions, and get the magazine published, get it into distribution. I had a magazine that we put together down in Austin, and we had somebody there who gave us a pathway into international distribution, so we were like distributing all over the world our little zine, right? The web gave us a way to do that without fiddling with paper and the high cost of printing and publishing. So we started publishing there. And throughout the early 90s, a lot of people were publishing like this. They were putting things on the web. It required an understanding of markup language, at least, HTML, to be able to construct a web page. And web page construction and design got more and more complex, as you know, over a period of time. And what happened in the midst of the 90s, about midway through, we had these bigger content sites starting to appear. One of the earliest business models for the web is put up a site that publishes a lot of content, like an online magazine, and then put ads on that. And in order to do that in a big way, you wanted to have a system that made it easy for you to publish without having to code every page in HTML. So we created something called content management systems that were template-based, where there would be a page template where everything was kind of set up, and then you could just put your text in there and publish it. That was a very efficient way to publish to the web. And early content management systems were big and really expensive. I worked on one that was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Toward the end of the decade of the 90s, there were people who started creating personal publishing sites, journals, that sort of thing. And some of those people were also developers who were thinking about how great it would be to have a sort of personal content management system. So that's where the blog came from. There were a few projects to create content management systems that were very light and inexpensive, close to free. Blogger, for instance, when it first appeared, was $35 a year, and now it's, you know, free. And Blogger was the first platform that I used, and probably the most widely used early platform for blogging. Boing Boing, are you all familiar with Boing Boing? Supposedly the most popular blog on the web. Those guys are kind of friends of mine, and they had started on Blogger and have evolved through. For years they were on a platform called Movable Type, and now they're on a platform called WordPress. These are all very light content management systems, and WordPress has become sort of like the platform to use. I promised I would answer this question. WordPress tends to be very easy. It's very light. It's easy to set up. There's actually a WordPress.com site where you don't even have to do the setup. You can just join the site and create your blog there. So WordPress is, I think there's a pretty broad consensus that it's sort of the tool of choice for blogging. Some of these other tools still exist, and there's some really good other tools, but WordPress has become sort of the most popular, and it was created by a guy down in Houston who was, I think he was still a teenager when he started creating it, a guy named Matt Mullenweg. And he was one of a number of people who were trying to create personal publishing systems that were cheap or free, very easy to use, and would allow people to create their own media. So that's really the basis of blogging, and it becomes the basis of social media. Everybody being able to create their own media and being able to share it. On the internet, anybody can make and share media now, and that's what you're seeing on Facebook. And Facebook actually, in some ways, it's like, if you have a Facebook account, it's kind of like you have a blog platform, because you know you can post updates there. They're reasonably short updates. Blog posts tend to be short. But the real change that we've seen in media over the last couple of decades is that we've gone from a world of broadcast media, which is many to many, to a world of social media. Broadcast is one to many, and a world of social media is many to many. And what that means is that there's, instead of a few channels for publishing and information, or like 3 television networks that you pay attention to, there's more and more choices. There's more and more ways to get media, to get content. It may be text, it may be video, it may be audio. More and more it's convergent. You find more and more people publishing all of these things. They may have a blog and a podcast and be posting videos on YouTube and embedding them in their blog and so forth. So that is the world that we're in today. There's many, many channels, many, many voices, and the question is how you find an audience if you're creating your own blog, either for yourself or your organization. Basically, you're creating a sort of small publishing system for either your personal use or for your company, for your nonprofit. Are most of the people in here nonprofits? Okay, good. So nonprofits have been using blogs very effectively. But kind of the issue with that is that there's some overhead in blogging, and we'll get to that in a minute. But with blogs, you can, and with other forms of social media, you can move from the sort of broadcast way of just blasting things out and hoping it hits somebody who's interested, to really sort of targeting and finding people who will absolutely read and engage with your content. So how do you find an audience? My position, my strongly held position for several years now has been that the only way to deal with this audience building idea in a world where there's so many channels of information, if you're coming into it as a small organization or as an individual, you need to look at your social network. And by social network, I don't mean Facebook or Twitter or something like that. Those are platforms that sort of facilitate social networking, but your social network is all the people you're connected to. And if you're an organization, let's say you're a nonprofit, there's a bunch of people and organizations that are kind of in your ecosystem, in your sphere of influence that you can identify. We've done processes before where we would bring, say, a nonprofit into a room and just kind of work it on the whiteboard, say, who are the people that you're connected to? Who are the people that are essential to you? And when I say people, it's people in organizations, that sort of thing. What are your connections? Who are you connected to? And how do you reach those people? That's really your obvious audience. And to go a step further, thinking about who within all the people that you're connected to or all the organizations you're connected to will have the most influence, because by connecting to people who have influence, who are hubs rather than nodes in a network, do you all understand that distinction? A hub has many connections and a node is just, a few connections. So in what we call a scale-free network, any part of the network can have an unlimited number of connections, and the ones with the bigger numbers of connections we call hubs. And hubs in a network are very attractive in a sense, because if you can engage with them and have them engage with you, that creates a path of influence for you. On the other hand, that engagement doesn't just happen because you ask for it, are many of you on LinkedIn? Do you get a lot of requests from people that you don't know from Adam? Well, I do. And part of it is that I've been on LinkedIn for a long time, and I'm actually connected with a lot of people. I know a lot of people who are already online, so a lot of us were on LinkedIn, and I happen to be one of the LinkedIn people who has a lot of connections. So people will try to connect to me because I have all of these connections. It's trying to establish a path of influence, but it makes no sense if you don't know the person you're trying to connect to, or if there's no, sort of reason for the engagement to occur. So if somebody asks me to be their friend or to be their professional connection, and I don't know them or know anything about them and have no reason to do that, it ain't going to happen, right? So what you do is you look for the people who are going to know who you are when you walk through the door, people who will engage with you more readily, and start blogging and building your blog with them in mind. And then you work through them, because every person that you connect with is not just a person, but they're also a node in a network. And influencers are hubs in a network. So as you work through them, you reach more and more people. So that is, to me, the most sensible way to approach building an audience. There's other ways to do it. You could run a bunch of Google ads, they're not really that effective. You could run Facebook ads. They're actually more effective than Google ads within Facebook. If the people you want to reach are on Facebook, that could be good. And that brings us to this other question of why you should be blogging at all if you have these other social media facilities like Facebook, like Twitter, like LinkedIn, YouTube. There's a number of ways that you can connect with people. We've sort of standardized on the Facebook, Twitter networks so far, and Google Plus is starting to be kind of a contender. And a lot of people ask, why should I have a blog? In fact, some people say that the blog is dead. But I don't think the blog is dead at all. In fact, you see blogs everywhere still. And from my position, a blog is kind of a necessary thing if you're really trying to build a very whole social media strategy and social media presence. For one thing, your blog can be your website or can be a piece of your website, but you want to have a place where you have core content about you or your organization, whatever it is you're trying to presence. So let's say you're a small nonprofit, and there's a lot of things you want people to be able to know about you. Obviously, in this day and age, you're going to put all that into a website. That website can be the website that includes your blog, and then the blog is actually a dynamic sort of flow of content that is regularly updating people about you. And as you post new content on some regular and periodic basis, then you can go to your social media platforms. You can go to Facebook, for instance, post those links on Facebook, and all the people that you're connected with on Facebook have the opportunity to see those links and share those links and spread your blog post around. But you're pointing back to the blog post, which is a longer form communication, which means that you can say more with it. It's more robust. You can have a longer and detailed blog post and then a short form post to something like Twitter or Facebook that points to it. The other thing is that if you have a strong and persistent web presence, it's just good support for your brand, and it's something that it's your calling card too. I mean, everybody's got their link on their card now, but the link itself links to sort of an extension of the card that you hand people. People want to know more about you than you can put on a small business card, and the way to provide that information is by having what I refer to as core content, all the information about you in a place where it's accessible that you can just point people. And the other piece is that you can have conversations if you choose. There's a certain amount of overhead here. But if you have a blog, all blog platforms, I can't think of any that don't, will support conversations if you want to enable that. It's often enabled by default in something like WordPress. So when you are posting something, it can be a conversation opener, and you can be looking to engage people in a conversation that could be strategic and productive for you. How it's strategic and how it's productive would be something that you would define in determining your strategy for all this. Because when you're setting up a blog, when you're setting up a social media ecosystem for yourself, so to speak, all the different pieces of it are there, you absolutely want to have goals in the beginning and have a clear strategy for that. And you have to know that you can take the time to do it. And I'm not going to you're going to hear a lot of other people today who will talk about how to put together a social media campaign, and we'll focus on very specific forms of social media. But just focusing on the blog, I want to talk about the ingredients that blogging require from you, what you really have to have in place. First is discipline and time. This is a hard one. A lot of people, when I talk to them about blogging or the need for blogging, say, well, when will I ever find time? You know, they say that about Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Well, that's it. I mean, if you don't have time, you can't do it. So that's a prerequisite. And it's not just a little bit of time. I'll talk more about the time requirements in a minute. The other thing is goals. I already mentioned that. You need to know why you're doing it, what you're trying to accomplish with it. And it could be, you know, like for me, I'm a writer. I was trained as a writer. I like to write. I have things that I'm interested in that I like to talk about. So I have a blog, Weblogski, the one that I mentioned, it's not built on a business goal, but it's built on a personal goal. It's really just my goal to communicate about things that interest me and, you know, try to build some conversations around that. I don't have a lot of conversations on my blog. I've tried to figure that out. I finally realized that it has something to do with my voice. People are more responsive in social media, like when I post a link there, but voice is an important consideration here. You can have a very sort of, a writer's voice tends to be kind of authoritative, so if you're trained as a writer and you come out and you just say, this is it, you know, people don't necessarily feel that they can kind of come back to that, and you're not going to get as many comments as you would if you were kind of more solicitous in the way that you post and say, you know, I have this question, you know. Ask people a question and they'll answer it. You may get more comments that way. So, the ability to write. This is an issue for some people. If you can't write, if you don't know how to write, it's going to be really hard for you to have a blog and have it work, right? So one thing you can do is you can study and learn how to be a better writer. Another thing you could do is like outsource it. Or, you know, it could be a deal killer. It could be that you're not going to have a blog because you're really not comfortable writing the blog. And writing is hard work, which I'll get to again in a minute. But it's very powerful if you're a good storyteller, if you can write well enough. Not necessarily write just exceptionally well, but well enough. If you're a good enough writer and you have some stories to tell and they're good stories, you can engage people with a blog. And there's a lot of people that have blogs that are not the world's greatest writers, but they have very popular blogs because they're interesting, you know, and they have something to say. And they take a position, which is really important. You really want to take a position. Authenticity is huge in the social media world. And actually, Debbie and I were talking about this, about how people are starting to accept less authenticity than they might have on the internet in the past. But really, people want to hear an authentic voice. They want to know that you're telling the truth and feel that you're telling the truth. They want to know that you're not just trying to persuade them or propagandize them or market to them in some way, but that you're a human being, you're a person, and you're speaking with that kind of authenticity. So that feeds into your consideration of what kind of voice you want to have as a blogger. It's very important to write as you, the authentic person. Now you may have to, let's say you have an organization and you have a chain of command. You may have to have some structure for getting things approved and so forth. So it's not like you just write anything you want to. There are larger organizations that will have like social media councils or something like that within the organization that help make decisions about social media, and they may have a set of policies and a set of constraints and so forth. But this, even in this context, you want to have an authentic voice as much as you possibly can. And you want to have a clear and consistent voice. You want to make sure that you're not bouncing around too much. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't have different voices. That usually is like you have a group blog, you have different people who post. But it would be good to be clear that it's different people. So, you know, if you have a multi-author blog, make sure that the posts have bylines and that people understand this was a different author from that author. I already mentioned being ready to take a position. That's important too. You don't want to be wishy-washy in what you're blogging about. You want to be, you know, pretty forceful about your thoughts and opinions. Of course, probably not going to just write your opinions, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And then the other thing is that, of course, you want to be extremely ethical. Journalists have ethics. They have a code of ethics. And one of the reasons that journalists were a little wary of bloggers is that here's all these people who are becoming content producers. Some of them are getting a lot of eyeballs, and they don't know journalism, and they have not been exposed to our ethics, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a big conversation between journalists who believe in social media and bloggers who don't know a lot about journalism, where they're saying, you know, let us help you understand some things about the context that a journalist comes from that will help you make your blog better, partly because you'll understand the standards and ethics of journalism and the fact that we do fact checking and we get multiple sites for a story and so forth, so that when you publish something, it will have better credibility, and the credibility of the thing that you publish will be obvious. Now, that's not a consideration for everybody, but if you were, say, going to become a news blogger, because there are kind of specializations in blogging, and not just blog about your organization, but say you want to be blogging news pieces or you want to be breaking news, then it's important to think about some of these journalistic standards that exist that can really help you if you understand them. And accountability, of course, clearly you want to, some human being should be associated with things that are being posted on the blog and take responsibility for those. And the organization will take responsibility for them if it's an organizational blog. And that means, you know, responsibility is it carries some overhead with it too. And transparency, you don't really want to conceal, you want to reveal in the things that you post. Okay, here's the hard part. If you're going to have a blog, you're going to have to write the blog. And it can be time consuming. I want to refer you to a website. It's called Copyblogger. Copyblogger is a really good reference for bloggers. They have great content about blogging. I think it's copyblogger.com. They have several things that they do. They also publish a blog theme system for WordPress as Studio Press. But on the Copyblogger blog, they give a lot of good tips and guidelines, and they have like an online marketing course that you can sign up for free. And it's all really good information. And I think they have said, and I've felt myself, though I don't always do it, that you should put at least a couple of hours into a blog post. It's easy to dash these things off. And you can do it. I mean, you can write a blog post in 15 minutes, but it's just not going to have much weight to it, you know. And, you know, that's sort of like you can toss off a tweet or you can toss off a Facebook post pretty quickly. Well, you could blog the way that you tweet and that you write for Facebook, but you're going to have at least some blog posts that are real and substantial. And when I say real, I mean it's a real written work where you put some time into it. Your blog will fare much better if you put 2 to 4 hours into every post, which means that that's going to limit the number of posts that you can make. And I don't, there's not really a hard and fast rule about how many times you should post a week on a blog, but usually I would say at least 3 posts a week. Some people post like multiple posts per day, but that would be really hard to do if you were going to put in the time on each post. If you were going to put in 2 hours on a post, 3 posts in a day, 6 hours. Well, blogging's probably not your profession, right? It's just something that you're going to do to help further your goals in some way. So, so your time is going to be limited. So don't feel that you have to blog every day or multiple times a day or anything like that. But try to come up with a consistent calendar, like an editorial calendar, a consistent schedule for blogging. And if you're an organization, there may be more than one person in the organization who could do a good job of adding to the blog. But if you want to have some kind of regular flow of content that doesn't get disrupted where it goes for like weeks without a post or something like that. So decide how many posts you're going to have per week, put them on a calendar, and have the discipline to make sure that you post when you said you were going to. And that sort of is the best way to address that. And be sure, and when you write something, don't publish it right away. Actually, I should say that to myself because I'm bad about that. I mean, I've had things where I wrote it and I published it and I looked at it later and said, oh my God, what did I do? And I have to go back and revise it. Take time to revise it a couple of times before you send it. I mean, when you go back and you start reading through it, you'll find all sorts of things. I mean, this is, as a writer, I know this really well. Every time I read through something that I've written, I'm going to change it. And I know people, a friend of mine, a guy named Howard Rheingold, he's been a writer for years, editor. He told me one time that he does 15 revisions on everything that he does. Well, I ain't going to do 15 revisions, but I'm going to do at least a couple. And you'll find yourself doing things like, it's really not unusual to take your closing paragraph and make it your opening paragraph, because it just works better that way. I mean, really look at what you've written critically and think about how it's going to communicate, and think about how your audience that you've already kind of defined is going to take it, you know, and make sure that it's going to be really clear. I have learned over the years, I used to think that I could write really fast and just get them out there. And I learned the hard way that anything that I've written as a first draft is suspect. And I find all kinds of issues with it. So now I think of a first written draft, as a gob of clay, and I got to sit there and mold it some. That's the best way to think about it. So write fast for your first draft, and then go back and take time to revise. And don't be your own strictest editor and cut stuff, you know, even if it's good, if it doesn't really fit. Yeah?
Question, do you kind of have like a target word count in mind, or does it just vary on the topic? Or is there kind of like a word count that you find, you know, engages the audience more than others?
On the internet or on the web, we have an assumption, a fairly common assumption, that people don't read really long posts. Actually, that's probably generally true, but depending on the type of blog, like if you have a very literary blog, it could be that you could write paragraph after paragraph. Usually 500 words would be somewhere from 200 to 500 words is what I usually shoot for. I don't really think a lot about word count. My blog posts and many blog posts that I see that kind of work tend to have, you know, somewhere from 3 to 5 paragraphs in them. And you know, there's another thing from journalism to remember, which is don't bury the lead. So make sure that early on in your first paragraph, you've made it really clear what you're saying. And then you can have a summary paragraph that makes it clear what you said. And in between, you know, you can have 2 or 3 paragraphs that tell the story, you know. And if you go like 3 to 5 paragraphs, that's probably going to be within that 200 to 500 word range. So that's kind of the way to do it. It's not a hard and fast rule, but people don't take time to just sit there and read something on the web usually. So if you can't get them in 3 or 4 paragraphs, then, you know, they're probably not going to read past that. And you've probably all seen that in your own behavior online. You probably read the first 2 or 3 paragraphs or something, and if it's going into a lot more detail that you don't really care as much about, you just go on and do something else. So think about how you read too. Oh, I picked this up. Actually, I tweeted it and said to my Twitter universe, I said, I'm going to give a talk tomorrow about blogging. This was an afterthought. It was last night. I'm going to give a talk tomorrow about blogging. What should I say, you know? And one thing that somebody said was something about like, nobody really cares what you think. And it's like, well, really, it's true. People don't necessarily want to hear your opinions or what your thoughts are or what your philosophy is. They might. I mean, if they're really interested in you, or if you're like some great thinker, you know, that has a reputation for that. But really what you want to do is tell them a story or give them some really useful content in some way. And there's a real common thing in blogging. In a way it drives me crazy. I can't bring myself to do it, but I know people really like it, where they'll say, you know, 5 best ways to do something, or top 10 this or that. These lists, you know, where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 10. People eat that up, though. They really go for that, and it's really a good way to convey some information to people that's useful. I mean, basically you want to create content that's useful to people and that they'll engage with because they find it compelling. And I'm not really saying that it's not important what you think, but I'm just saying you should think about whether what you think or what you're injecting into your content is going to be meaningful to people, you know? Images really set a blog off, so I think it's important to add them, but you got to be careful about licensing. Now, I've sort of busted this myself because I didn't really ask for permission to use this image, but I thought it was great. This is a picture of a cake with Van Gogh's Starry Nights as the icing, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, what a lot of people will do and think of this, okay, they'll say, okay, I put that picture up and I gave a site for it. I said where I found it, or I said who shot the picture. That doesn't mean that you've satisfied copyright. There are Creative Commons licensed pictures, and you can actually, there's a Google search where you can like refine it to look for Creative Commons images. They're usually not that great, but you can find them there. You can find a lot of them on Flickr. They usually require you to at least give attribution, and some will want you to ask for permission. If you're going to use something that's copyright, all rights reserved, you shouldn't use it without permission. Now, what happens if you do that? If you have a blog that's, nobody's paying to read, where the content is offered for free, there's not a really strong case for like suing you for copyright infringement. That's usually more like if you're selling, if you were selling the image in some way. So a lot of people are using a lot of copyright images without permission and not getting sued for it. They might get a cease and desist if it comes to the attention of the copyright holder. It's not necessarily true that you would find yourself behind bars the next day if you put up an image without permission. And like in this context where I'm just giving a talk to you guys, it's probably not a big deal. But really, if you want to observe the letter of the law, you should check and see what the copyright status is of the image that you're using. And when in doubt, just ask permission. Track the person down, see who shot the photo. If you go to Wikipedia and you post a photo on there, they will immediately remove it unless you have documented very clearly the licensing, that it's either free or some kind of Creative Commons licensing is the most common. Does everybody know what I mean by Creative Commons? I think people are pretty familiar with it by now. Creative Commons is a great way to license content, and you may want to license your blog that way. If your interest is more in getting the word out, if you're not like, if you don't have some reason to want to enforce copyright, I mean, everything you write is going to be copyright according to, like if it's just you, it's your copyright, or if you're doing it for your organization, like writing for hire, it might be their copyright. What Creative Commons does is create a license for sharing, for people to take and share what you've written or like images you've put up. So if you use a Creative Commons license, you're not sacrificing your copyright. But what you're doing is that you're saying people have a license to use what you've written. And you put whatever restrictions on it. There's different licenses with different restrictions. Yes?
One of the things I touched about is some people in my organization don't really understand, separate from copyright, that putting pictures of people that have attended events or whatever may be problematic too, because they may not want their picture.
Yeah, because you don't have a release.
Right.
Yeah, I'm pretty attentive to that myself. I'll be out at an event or whatever, and I'll be shooting images, and I used to put those up just pretty willy-nilly, but then I came to understand that it's not necessarily a question of whether you have a release from the person so much as whether the person is just uncomfortable with the way they're depicted in the photo. So you probably should, if you have photos of people from an event, ask their permission, or if you wherever. If you're in news, like my understanding is that if you're, say, a news photographer and you're out shooting a story, let's say you're in at Occupy Wall Street and you're shooting photos of that, because it's news, you don't really have to go around and get releases from everybody. So context matters too. And I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert in this stuff, but you should be very attentive, especially if you're blogging for your organization. You should be very attentive to things like this.
Like children in it, for some reason that
Right.
caused more attention, a little more sensitive.
Yeah, and I've seen many situations where people really didn't want their children to be photographed and wouldn't want their children to be featured. Yeah, that's definitely something to be cautious about. And incidentally,
I can shed some light on that. If you want.
okay, sure.
As a press photographer, you are in a public place and you are using the photos for editorial purposes. You don't have to get anybody's permission to use them. But if you were in a private place, if I were shooting inside this hotel, I would need to get permission from the hotel, A, to shoot there, and I would also need to get releases. So it really depends most on your setting.
Like fresh air is public.
On the street, sidewalk, public parks, if you're in a public setting, you don't have to get people's permission to shoot anything. And the police will often like to tell you otherwise, they're wrong. But, it's up to you and the cop you're looking at.
But at a private party inside the courtyard, that would not be public.
Depends whose courtyard it is. Depends whose courtyard it is and where you are.
Yeah.
If you're on private property of any kind, the property owner has the right to ask you not to take photos.
Right. And if you're taking photos and people look like they're really uncomfortable with it, pay attention.
And John, I can address that too. From another perspective, from a slightly different perspective, there's those legal issues and then there's the ethical issue. So you've got to find that balance, particularly as a nonprofit. So for example, when I worked for the American Red Cross and we would open up a shelter. A shelter technically located on a school property is public property. However, we also realized that we were technically, legally, we could not keep cameras off premise. However, coming onto public property, we also realized there might be, for example, families, women with children who maybe were in abusive relationships and didn't need to be seen on camera.
Right.
Or for whatever reason. And so you kind of have to walk a very fine balance, particularly as a nonprofit, about who you're going to take pictures of, because you don't know what, particularly when you're dealing with clients, what their family life situation is. And so for nonprofits in particular, getting release forms is just the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not it's the legal thing to do. Okay?
Good.
I am going to tell you we are taking pictures of you all, and we will put them up. If you don't want it, let me know now.
You got those release forms ready? No, I can tell you one more thing it's important for you to know, and I know this from hard experience. If you take a picture of your spouse, get permission before you put it online. Okay? Yeah.
So would the recommendation be, let's say, you were planning to host some sort of event or function or workshop, just to include like a photo release as part of the registration, and that would be sufficient then?
To be safe, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
To be
Or
safe.
at the very least a sign. At the very least a sign that
Okay.
people can see. If you're not gonna, if it's a huge event and you don't want everybody to have to sign, right?
Should, yeah.
At the very least, a sign that says, you may be photographed, please let us,
Yeah.
We
I
actually
mean-
put a line about that at the top of our sign-in sheet for all of our events, is we will be taking photographs of this event. If you have an issue with that,
Okay.
please let us know, and that people can see.
I mean, there's a certain amount of overhead in kind of keeping track of who's in each photo and making sure you have a release, but it's, again, it's the right thing to do. But the blanket release sounds like a pretty good way to handle it. So one of the points I really want to be making here, and I'm not sure I've made it yet, is that I see the blog as pivotal to a social media presence. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I don't think the blog is dead. I think that it's critical to have. You can have everything sort of, I mean, what pivot means is a thing on which something turns, and your social media presence can turn on your blog. You can, in addition to the fact that you can have your core content there and have all of your dynamic flow of content, you can also reference all of your social media from the blog. Marginally, you know, you all know that you can get Twitter badges and Facebook badges and so forth. I mean, this can be like the central repository of all of your content, everything that's going on. And it can be a very powerful tool for that. And one other thing I was going to mention, I was talking about the importance of thinking about having conversations. I mean, social media is really a conversation. That's the big change. Like, for many years, people had conversations, and then we had this whole evolution of mass media from the Gutenberg press forward until eventually we had like a few broadcast operations that were just blasting things out to everybody, and there wasn't a good way to feed back. But really what people have always done is had conversations. And having a conversational form of media is natural and inherent, and because the internet facilitated it well, we just got back to that. We're having these conversations. In the early forums, say, well, I am a member of The Well, which has been around for 25 years, an online community. They have a form of forum where somebody will post an opening remark and there will be a bunch of responses, and that's a conversation. The conversation happens in the responses to this initial post. That's the same structure you can have with a blog. You post something and other people respond to it. So you can think of your blog, one way to think of it is a community platform where conversations can happen. And I said earlier that WordPress is an excellent platform for blogging. Drupal is a really good platform too, because it has, you can do like multiple blogs within it and community features and so forth. Okay, looks like we're close to the end. I realized after I put this presentation together that you were going to have some questions. These are questions that often get asked. And I don't think I have time to address them now. It says we kind of need to be thinking about cutting. See, I don't have my watch on, but what time is it? 5 till? Yeah, we're almost out of time. If you have questions like this, just come up and ask me. We probably should go ahead and wrap. So thank you.